after the destruction of Athens, they have to rebuild. So they rebuild the Acropolis in exactly this moment. All of what we're going to see in part 2 from the Parthenon is created at exactly that moment in the aftermath of the destruction. This is the new age, the third great age. If we look back, we can remind ourselves the age of heroes, Agamemnon, 1600 BC, then Cataclysm, 800. Homer, in Asia Minor, writes the story. More crisis, 600, 500, and then 450, a whole new world, a whole new culture, a whole new location. Athens, now that it held out, led the resistance to the Persians, emerges as the center of this new culture. And so, in this place, in this new world, the thinkers, the writers, the playwrights, the politicians, the poets will now try to summarize Greek culture at 450 in Athens. And that's what Sophocles is. 496 to 406. 496 to 406. 90 years. Quite a life. 90 years of writing over 100 plays. Almost all of them were huge hits. Imagine having 100 hits. How nice that would be. And popular successes, too. They would pack the theaters, 15, 20,000 people in some of the performances, because both Epidaurus and the theater in Athens can seat huge, thousands and thousands. And so this career, 496 to 406, you can see right away, can't you, that he's a man of around 40, 45, 50 at exactly the moment that Athens is rebuilding herself and her culture. You see? He's exactly the right age. His friend Pericles, one of his best friends, who will be a leader of Athens, he's also the same age. So they're both a whole generation of men around 40 or so in 450, all born maybe 410. And therefore they, in 450, 440, 430, they will be the ones who give us this voice to what we want to talk about here tonight. So, Athens, Sophocles, Pericles, Thucydides, Herodotus, the first historian. We give Herodotus that name because he's really the first writer to write about human affairs as if human beings formed those affairs, as if human beings made the decisions and created the societies that they lived in, instead of having the gods fly in every 5 minutes, change everything, build a new miraculous temple, or blow it down. Instead of that, Herodotus tells the story of human beings, and so therefore Herodotus is our first historian. So what we want to do is talk about the ideas and the age of Sophocles. So let's start out here. The ideal. What was the ideal? What was the ideal that the Greeks embraced? And where did it come from? The ideal is fairly simple. The pursuit of honor through vigorous action, sometimes violent, involving great risk, and in pursuit of some worthy, unselfish goal of value to one's family, one's community. This center of the Greek ideal is an idea that is brought into Greece with the Bronze Age charioteers, memorialized in their stories of the heroic age, Agamemnon, Troy, written down by Homer in the great stories, and memorialized for the later generations and embraced in the 5th century. So here we have tonight the perfect example of how these new people came into Europe, brought with them certain ideals, and those ideals then became the things that this society in Athens embraced. In other words, continuity. See? Continuity between Bronze Age charioteers, Homer and the Iliad, and Athens. Here's the first cornerstone of the ideal: the pursuit of honor through vigorous action, involving great risk, and in pursuit of some worthy, maybe unselfish, you can put a question mark around that, of a goal of value to one's fellow man. The accent on the physical action, of course, tips this in a certain way, And of course, it makes of superior the nature of body and the whole ethic of the body. So one could contrast this to both the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Chinese, or even the Indians. In no of those three cultures is there this kind of accent on the body. And in addition, this pursuit of this worthy ideal always carries with it an aesthetic quotient, an aesthetic value. It's always important to do certain things and do certain kinds of things, but also it's important how you do it and how you look when you do it. So, in other words, grace under pressure. That's a great phrase which you know endured all the way up to Hemingway. It's a key phrase in his books, his ideas. We need to be aware of how we do things and how we look as we do things, because this aesthetic value in Greek life is always a major important issue. It's probably from the kind of life they lived. That is, the seacoast, in the sun, outside all the time. If you compare it to the freezing cold Vikings up there and all that snow, they didn't care what they looked like. You know, they had all that hair all over their body and hair on their faces and hair on their arms, and so they didn't care anything about having you see what they looked like with their clothes off, because they would freeze to death. So therefore, not the same accent as in the Greek story. And that's one of the important things, right, to start with. And so the pursuit of this ideal is one in which you always honor the value of human dignity. That's another aspect of this. There's the aesthetic, there's the action, there's the risk, and then there is the importance of the individual. The individual is always at the center of all these stories, these values. The idea of the society, the idea of the education, the idea of their literature. It's always back to the importance of the individual. So individualism, which is a word that doesn't exist yet, that's a 19th century term, so we can use it, but we're engaged in an anachronism. Don't you love that word? Don't you love anachronism? Out of your time, out of your place. Well, we can't use individualism unless we're an anachronism. The accent on the individual, the importance of the individual at the center of all Greek values is absolutely central. And you can compare Greek society to Egyptian society or Greek society or Mesopotamian society of exactly the same period, and you don't see this kind of accent on the individual. In other words, the accent on the individual in the Western tradition is there from the very beginning. From 2000 BC and Bronze Age charioteers, it's there from the very beginning, and it's not present across the Mediterranean in some of these other neighboring societies. So that's very important to remember tonight as we keep building these pieces of our understanding here of what Greece is all about. The importance of the individual. The accent on the physical action, probably has within it a negative side. That is, the positive side, of course, is that it raises up the individual and it gives the Western tradition the accent on the individual in the very beginning. And then on the other side, it probably encouraged a kind of warrior culture, an imperialistic drive, a push to conquest, to soldiers who need war. All of these things, of course, are questions that are in Homer, that are in these books. One more aspect of this, the ideal, the pursuit of honor. The honor code carries with it an intensely individualistic morality, because ultimately the great hero, the Achilles, who is attempting to live up to the standard of the honor code among all these other men who are also trying to do so, finally and always comes down to an internal intensely self-analytical evaluation. So it's very individualistic. It's very, very much an accent on the person, and it's very, very interior. So you remember, if you look at Book 1 and you read that wonderful passage where Achilles is about to rise up and kill Agamemnon, and he stops, and he thinks, and he moves back and forth, and he tries to decide what he should do, and then finally the gods intervene. But the important thing is that finally you're always thinking about society and what your fellow man will think of you and your actions. Now, where did this honor code come from? Where did this idea that we just elaborated, the honor code, where did it come from? Bronze Age charioteers. Bronze Age charioteers. That's the kind of code they brought with them. That's the kind of idea that they brought with them. They are invading with their horses and their chariots and their armies, but they also carry with them ideas and stories and gods. And in fact, they will bring the stories and the gods with them, and those stories and gods will be yielded to the Greek culture in the centuries afterwards. So the Mycenaean culture we talked about, the heroic age, they're building with these ideas, and then Homer will enshrine these ideals in his book. Now think about that. Think about the chronological marriage that we're seeing here. We're seeing a people that comes into Greece in 1900, 1800, 700 BC, settles down, goes through catastrophic change, and then is remembered in a book written by somebody who writes it at around 800 BC. And that person writes it down in such a spectacularly successful poem that every Greek schoolboy learned that poem when they studied. Many wealthy families owned a copy, and many individuals carried the copy with them. So, for example, Alexander, about whom we're going to talk fairly soon, Alexander carried his copy of the Iliad with him at all times and had it under his pillow at night. Don't you love that? And it was his copy that Aristotle had given him with his notations. The power of Homer and the Iliad was ubiquitous and enduring through centuries and centuries and centuries. So the stories that come from 1800 BC, memorialized in 800 BC, carry all the way into Athens in 450 BC. Get it? What's the nature of this honor code? Well, number one, it's positive. It tells you what to do. It's not a whole long list of thou shalt nots. Get out there, be active, do things. That's good. Number two, it's active. It commands you to get moving, stand up, work, go, travel, expand your territory, all of those things. And so it will be like the long story of Western civilization, always expanding, always looking for new territory, always striking out into a new area. And of course, that's one of the things that other cultures criticize, is that dynamic drive to expand. So number three, human dignity. The accent on the human being at the center of the code, the perfection of the code in human dignity, with a sense of grace under pressure at the center. Number four, intensely personal. Strong accent on individual, strong accent on individualism. And number five, very competitive. So built into this code was the idea of competition. And then is how you became excellent. You competed against other men. And yes, somebody's going to say, wait, this sounds very masculine. Well, it was. It was. This is a warrior culture. This is a culture that is carrying in these values. In their chariots, they're at war. They're expanding. They're conquering territory. And so, yes, it is. Intensely competitive. One against another. Races being run. Competitions. 776, an official new competition called the Olympics, 776. Just remember that. That's the time of Homer. Homer's alive and writing his book right then, 776. That's the first Olympic. So competition built right into it. Militant, aggressive, soldiers. A lot of this has to do with armies and soldiers. And potentially violent, of course. We just have to remember that. All these ideals that are contained within this ethic involve potential conflict, potential war, and people can get hurt. So that's part of it. Let's think back about the Iliad, and let's think about Achilles, because, of course, that's the character, that's the story that opens the book. And incidentally, when you think about Homer and you think about him being a great artist, think about where he starts the book and where he ends the book. You see, there's lots more stories. There's all the other years of the war before he writes his book, and there's more after. And he chooses to open it where he does and close it where he does. So that's a big insight into the author. But he opens with the great rage of Achilles, and therefore at the center of this book one, and the drama we looked at last week, is Achilles, the rage of Achilles, and the heroic ideal. And here we have a great dilemma. The hero must always test himself against what his conscience says, what he should be, what he should do, and the external world. And the only opinion that matters finally is his own conscience, the conscience of the hero in pursuit of honor, who must behave properly, who must behave beautifully, who must behave gracefully under pressure. All of these things are part of what he hopes to achieve. But finally, it's his internal self, his internal structure that allows him to evaluate what he's done. Always that question is, has he been true to himself? You know that phrase, to thine own self be true. This is another line that will run through Western civilization all the way from this moment, the Greeks, right down to the present, to thine own self be true. So at the center of this heroic honor code is the individual and the individual conscience. And also how one is seen by one's fellow men. And so you have two things. You have the human interior, internal self-evaluation that has to go on, and you have the external world, the society, the people around you, all the other evaluations that will be important. So, the great dilemma, and more intensely understood now in the 5th century and in Athens and in the time of Pericles and Sophocles, is what happens when there is a conflict between the self, internal values, and the community around you. That's book one. That's what that's about. What should Achilles do? What should Achilles do? He knows he's essential to the war. He knows that he should cooperate and help. And yet, his internal self says he's been violated by Agamemnon. His rights have been trampled on. And he cannot do it. His conscience will not let him do it. And so those men go to visit him, Odysseus and the other men. They say, please come back, please come back. There you have it, right there. The test. Individualism, great value. We think it's a good thing. The Greeks thought it was a good thing. The Bronze Age charioteers thought it was a very good thing, because usually there were maybe one or two on those chariots, so it was very individualistic. What do you do when there's the conflict between the individual and the individual's conscience and the opinion of one's fellow man? And this is, of course, exactly what we get in that opening of the Iliad. Sing, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades strong souls of heroes, and gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs. So that's the story. That's the story of the Iliad. In other words, Homer, saving these stories from the older age, knows that in the society of his cities, and he's living in prosperous cities, that in his society of prosperous cities, the individualism of the heroic age may be a problem. He already knows that, and by 450, the Athenians really know that. By 450, the Athenians really understand the essence of the conflict between individual and society. Because as the society grows, as the number of citizens in the society grows, as the society of Athens becomes more and more complex, by the high point it's probably 250,000 members, with maybe 50,000 voters, depending on what percentage of the 250 were adults and children, etc. But a very large body politic that would be very, very well informed on the rights of citizens. So what would be the essence of life in Athens by 450 BC but a conflict between individualism and communitarianism? How do they work together? Isn't it interesting how little has changed? I mean, if you think of it, isn't that right? I mean, when you think about it, really, that's not that much different now, 2,500 years later. The essential dilemma often is that very dilemma in Western civilization.